I'm a country veterinarian who spent the last 6 years stitching up livestock and keeping to myself. I didn't believe in divine appointments until the October afternoon. I jumped a dead battery on a dirt road. The woman behind the wheel looked exhausted, the kind of tired that comes from carrying a whole family alone. Her 3-year-old triplets sat perfectly silent in the back, three identical sets of brown eyes watching me like they'd been waiting for someone to finally stop. I had the engine running in 10 minutes and was turning to leave when one of them rolled down her window and whispered, "Be our daddy." The mother's face went pale. She hurriedly thanked me and drove off before I could say a word. I told myself it was just a child's confusion, a phase, but the question burrowed under my skin like a splinter I couldn't dig out. I learned her name was Sarah, a widow who'd lost her husband in a farming accident a year earlier. He'd been a good man, everyone said. But what I didn't know yet, couldn't have known, was the promise he'd extracted from his daughters in his final days. I found out 3 days later at the church potluck. I almost didn't go. Social gatherings weren't my thing, but Mrs. Calloway, the church secretary, had cornered me at the feed store and said she'd made her lemon bars especially. You didn't say no to Mrs. Calloway. So there I was, paper plate in hand, trying to disappear into a corner when I saw them across the fellowship hall. The same exhausted woman, the same three little girls in matching yellow dresses, their dark curls pinned back with clips. Sarah. She saw me the same instant I saw her, and the color drained from her face. She started to turn away to hide, but one of the triplets, I later learned her name was Lily, spotted me and broke into a run. Before Sarah could stop her, Lily slammed into my legs, wrapped her arms around my knees, and stared up with those enormous brown eyes. "You came back," she said, not like a question, like a confirmation. The other two followed, and suddenly I was surrounded by a swarm of identical faces, all of them looking up at me with a kind of hope I hadn't seen directed my way in years. Sarah rushed over, apologizing, her voice tight with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry. They don't understand boundaries yet. Please just ignore them." But I couldn't ignore them. And I couldn't ignore the fact that my heart was beating faster than it had in 6 years of quiet, solitary living. She sat down with me on the church steps while the potluck continued inside. The triplets played in the grass nearby, close enough that we could see them, far enough that they couldn't hear. And Sarah told me everything. Her husband, David, had been a good man, the kind who fixed tractors for neighbors for free and never raised his voice. A year ago, a baler malfunctioned, and he was gone in an instant. The farm had been their dream, and after he died, it became her prison. Too much land to manage alone, too many bills piling up, and three little girls who asked every night when their daddy was coming home. At first, she told them the truth, that daddy was in heaven. But the girls, only 3 years old, couldn't comprehend forever. So in his final weeks, David had done something desperate and beautiful. He'd gathered his daughters around his hospital bed, weak from the chemotherapy that couldn't save him, and made them a solemn promise. "Girls," he'd whispered, his voice already fatting, "I can't stay, but I'm going to send you a good man, someone kind, someone who will stop when others drive past, and you'll know him by how he treats you. When you see him, you tell him what we talked about." The pact wasn't just a father's comfort. It was his last act of love, planting a seed of hope that would outlive him. And for a full year, the triplets had been watching every stranger who crossed their path. The mailman, the grocery clerk, the man who fixed their fence. Each time they'd whisper to each other, "Is that the one?" Each time Sarah had to explain, "Not yet, Bobby's." Until the afternoon I pulled over on a dirt road, walked up to their dead battery and showed them a simple kindness. When she finished, I didn't know what to say. "I'm just a veterinarian. I stitch up goats, vaccinate horses, and spend most evenings eating dinner alone in a house that hasn't heard a child's laugh since I bought it. I'm not anyone's idea of a savior." But Lily had looked at me like I was the answer to a prayer, and that look had cracked something open inside me that I thought I'd sealed shut years ago. I asked Sarah if she needed help with the farm. Real help, not charity. I told her I could look at her livestock, maybe fix a few things around the place. It wasn't a proposal, it wasn't even close. It was just one broken person offering to help another. But the moment the words left my mouth, I saw a shift in her eyes. Fear and relief tangled together, like she'd been handed a lifeline and was terrified to grab it. Over the next 2 weeks, I started showing up at her farm. I vaccinated her 2 dairy cows, treated a case of mastitis that would have killed the herd, and patched a hole in the barn roof. The triplets followed me everywhere, chattering about their chickens and their imaginary pony, and I found myself looking forward to the chaos in a way that scared me. Sarah and I talked long after the girls were in bed, about her husband, about my years of solitude, about the judgment farmers face when they fall behind. She told me the bank was circling, that they'd given her 60 days to bring the loan current or lose the land. The same land her husband had poured his life into. I started to care, more than I wanted to admit, but the whispers in town were already starting. A widower and a veterinarian with no family of his own, showing up at a pretty widow's house every day. Some said it was sweet. Others said I was taking advantage of a grieving woman. A few suggested Sarah was looking for a replacement husband to save her farm. I told myself I didn't care what people thought, but the old wounds don't heal just because you ignore them. I'd spent years building walls to protect myself from the kind of pain that comes from letting people in, and now 3 little girls with the eyes of their father were dismantling it brick by brick. Then on a Thursday evening, with the girls finally asleep and the sun bleeding orange across the pasture, Sarah took my hand and said something that turned everything upside down. "Matthew," she whispered, "there's something else you need to know, something I haven't told anyone." And what she revealed next would tie my life to hers in a way that no one saw coming. The secret David had kept from everyone, even from his own parents, was a letter, not the kind you send through the mail. The kind you write when you know you're dying and need to say the things you can't say out loud. He'd handed it to Sarah on his last good day, made her promise not to open it until she found the man she could trust with his girls. "When the right one shows up," he'd said, "you'll know, and when you do, give him this." Sarah walked me to an old hope chest in her bedroom, lifted a quilt her grandmother had stitched, and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name on it. Matthew. He'd never met me. He didn't know I existed, but there it was in his handwriting, addressed to the stranger who would one day stand in his place. She pressed it into my hands. "Read it when you're ready," she said. "I haven't opened it. I promised I wouldn't." Her voice was steady, but her hand trembled as it left the paper. I took the letter home that night and sat at my kitchen table, staring at it until the coffee went cold. When I finally opened it, the words inside didn't just surprise me. They rearranged something fundamental about why I'd been driving down that dirt road in the first place. David wrote that he'd known his cancer was terminal 6 months before he passed. In that time, he'd done something most dying men don't do. He'd written letters to a dozen men in the county, men he'd heard were decent, hardworking, maybe a little lonely, asking them to watch over his family if anything happened to him. Most never replied. A few sent polite notes declining. But one letter, the letter he'd intended to send to me, never got mailed because he'd learned I was as broken as they came. The town talk about the scarred veterinarian who kept to himself had reached him. "I was going to ask you," he wrote, "but I heard you already carried too much weight. I didn't want to add to your burden." Then, in a twist of fate that still makes my chest ache, David had a dream the night before the accident. A man with a scarred face was standing by his wife's car on a back road, jumper cables in hand, and 3 little girls were calling him Daddy. He'd woken up, told Sarah about the dream, and they'd both dismissed it as morphine and wishful thinking. But he'd written it down anyway, sealing it in this letter just in case. "If you're reading this," the letter ended, "then I was right. God sent you. Not to replace me, no one can replace a father, but to finish what I started. Take care of my girls. And take care of yourself too. You've been alone long enough." I read it 4 times. By the fourth reading, my own tears had smeared the ink. The next morning, I went back to Sarah's farm earlier than usual. I found her in the barn, trying to lift a hay bale that was clearly too heavy for her. She'd been doing that for a year, lifting things too heavy, carrying burdens no one should carry alone, because there was no one else. I took the bale from her without a word and set it on the stack. Then I told her about the letter. I told her about David's dream. And when I finished, she broke down in a way she hadn't allowed herself to since the funeral. But here's the thing. That letter didn't just bring us closer. It also put a target on our backs. A week later, I was at the county extension office picking up some vaccine orders when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. Two men in suits were talking to the clerk about the old Henderson place, Sarah's farm. One of them, a slick-looking guy with an expensive watch, was saying something about the widow won't last through winter, and we'll get it at auction for half its value. I recognized the name on his briefcase, Prescott Development. They'd been buying up failing farms all over the county, flipping them into subdivisions and commercial lots. The same company that had approached me 3 different times about selling my land. I confronted them right there in the lobby. Asked what business they had with Sarah's farm. The slick one smiled like I was a child who didn't understand how the world works. The bank is calling in her loan, he said. She's got 45 days to come up with $120,000 or the property goes to the highest bidder. We're just positioning ourselves to bid. 120,000. I knew her farm was underwater. She told me about the missed payments, but I hadn't realized how deep the hole was. David's medical bills had drained their savings long before the Baylor accident. The life insurance had covered the funeral and little else. She'd been running on fumes and hope for months. I drove back to Sarah's place that afternoon, my mind racing. When I arrived, I found a pickup truck I didn't recognize parked in the driveway. A man in his 50s, with a ruddy face and a confidence that bordered on menace, was standing on the porch talking to Sarah. The triplets were clinging to her legs, their eyes wide. I recognized him from the county fair circuit, Richard Lansing, a wealthy cattleman who owned half the grazing land in the eastern part of the county and had a reputation for getting what he wanted. He saw me pull up and his smile didn't waver. "Dr. Vale," he said, extending a hand like we were old friends. I was just offering Sarah a solution to her financial troubles. A generous one. Sarah's face was pale. "He wants me to sell him the farm," she said, her voice tight, "and marry him." Lansing laughed like it was the most reasonable proposal in the world. "I'm a practical man. She needs security. I need a wife who can manage a household. The girls would want for nothing. It's a business arrangement that benefits everyone." I felt a surge of anger I hadn't experienced since the accident that left me scarred. "She's not a business arrangement," I said, "and the answer is no." Lansing's eyes narrowed for just a moment, then the smile returned. "I've got lawyers, Vale. I've got connections at the bank. I've got resources you can't match. You're a small-town vet with a busted face and a 50-acre hobby farm. What are you going to do, scrape together 120 grand out of your savings jar?" I didn't have an answer for that because he was right. I had some savings, but not nearly enough, and the clock was ticking. That night after the girls were asleep, Sarah and I sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator. We added up her assets, her debts, the value of the equipment, the livestock. The math was brutal. Even if she sold everything, she'd still be short by $80,000. The farm was worth more than the loan, but the bank wouldn't extend more credit without collateral she didn't have. "We could sell the timber rights," I suggested. The farm had a small woodlot at the back, old-growth oak that might fetch a decent price. "I've already promised that to the girls," she whispered. "David wanted them to have a place to build tree houses. It's the one thing I can't give up." Then Lily, the one who'd first whispered to me at the roadside, shuffled into the kitchen in her pajamas. She'd been listening from the hallway. She climbed onto my lap, looked up at me with those unnervingly wise eyes and said, "Daddy said you'd help us. He told us in our dreams. Are you going to keep your promise?" I looked at Sarah. She was barely holding it together. The next morning, I made a decision. I called my own bank, the one that held the mortgage on my little farm. I asked about a second mortgage, a home equity loan, anything that could raise quick cash. The loan officer was sympathetic but blunt. My property didn't have enough equity to cover that kind of debt. I'd need a cosigner, someone with assets, someone willing to bet on me. There was only one person in the county who fit that description. My estranged brother, Owen, who I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. The fallout had been ugly. A dispute over our parents' will, a fistfight at the reading, a decade and a half of stony silence. He'd gone on to inherit the family construction business, built it into a regional empire, while I'd gone off to veterinary school and patched up my loneliness with animals who couldn't leave. I knew making that call would crack open wounds neither of us had healed. But I also knew that if I didn't, Sarah would lose her home, the triplets would lose the only life they'd ever known, and Richard Lansing would get exactly what he wanted. So I picked up the phone. And then I learned something that changed everything. Owen hadn't just been waiting for my call. He'd been waiting for something else entirely, something that tied him directly to the same forces that were trying to destroy Sarah. And the revelation would force me to choose between the brother I'd lost and the family I was just beginning to find. The call to Owen never happened. Before I could dial his number, he showed up at my farm unannounced, stepping out of a black Cadillac that looked obscenely out of place on my gravel drive. 15 years had turned my older brother from a scrawny kid with a chip on his shoulder into a polished man in a tailored suit, but the coldness in his eyes was exactly the same. He didn't offer a handshake. He just stood there, surveying my modest acres like a developer calculating lot sizes. "I heard you've been playing hero for the Henderson widow," he said, skipping any pretense of a reunion. "I also heard you're looking for money. Thought I'd save you the long-distance charges." I should have been surprised that he knew about Sarah, but I quickly realized I shouldn't have been. Owen didn't just own a construction company anymore. He'd quietly become the majority shareholder in Prescott Development 3 years earlier through a series of shell corporations that only the most persistent county auditor could trace. Richard Lansing wasn't the power behind the land grab. He was just Owen's front man, a local face to hide the fact that my own brother was systematically buying up every distressed farm in the county. The revelation landed like a physical blow. I stood on my porch, gripping the railing, while Owen explained it with a smile that never reached his eyes. After our father's will drove us apart, he'd sworn he would own everything our parents ever touched. He'd already acquired the old Morris place, the Ruiz farm, and half a dozen others. Sarah's was the last piece of a puzzle he'd been assembling for over a decade, and the bank calling her loan early. That wasn't coincidence. Owen had personally guaranteed a line of credit for the bank president's son-in-law, then called in a favor. "You're behind the foreclosure," I said, my voice flat. "You're doing this to hurt me," Owen shrugged. "Hurt you? No, Matthew. I'm doing this because I can. You could have sold me your share of the land 15 years ago and walked away rich. Instead, you clung to this dirt patch and that scarred-up pride of yours. Now you've gotten attached to a widow and her brood, and that gives me leverage I never expected." He laid out his terms with the casual cruelty of a man who'd forgotten how to feel. I had two choices. One, I could sell him my farm, the land our parents had left me, at a quarter of its market value, and he'd release the lien on Sarah's property and pay off her debt. Two, I could refuse and he'd foreclose on Sarah, take her farm, and then use the public drama to drag my name through enough mud that my veterinary practice would dry up. Either way, he'd own the land. The only question was whether I'd lose everything else along with it. I told him I needed time. He gave me 5 days. After he left, I drove straight to Sarah's. I found her in the garden, the triplets playing with a litter of barn kittens nearby. When I told her what Owen had revealed, she didn't break down. She got quiet. Then she led me inside and pulled out a box of David's papers she'd never fully gone through. Beneath tax returns and equipment manuals, we found a file folder labeled Sunnydale Holdings. Inside were notes David had been compiling for months before his cancer diagnosis. He'd been researching the suspicious land purchases, the bank pressure, the anonymous shell companies. He traced them back to Owen 2 years before anyone else suspected. David had known. He'd known that the same man who wanted to bulldoze his farm was my brother, and he decided not to tell Sarah because he didn't want to add another layer of grief to a marriage already shadowed by his illness. The only mention he'd made was in a separate note, folded at the bottom of the box, addressed simply to me. It was a letter he'd written but never mailed, dated 3 weeks before he died. "Matthew, if you're reading this, then you've stumbled into the same fight I couldn't finish. Your brother is a hollow man. He doesn't want the land, he wants to prove he's better than everyone. Don't let him use your goodness against you, but also don't let him make you hate. The girls need a father who can forgive, not one who carries poison. Whatever you decide, remember that the land is just dirt. The people are what matter." I read that line 3 times. David, who'd never met me, had understood my deepest struggle better than I did. I'd spent 15 years nursing resentment toward Owen, letting it shape my solitude, my scars, my entire identity. And now the choice wasn't just about saving a farm. It was about saving my own soul from becoming as hollow as his. The 5 days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and desperate strategizing. I talked to a lawyer, a wiry woman named Joanne Kepler who'd fought big agriculture for decades and had a particular hatred for developers like Prescott. She discovered a critical weakness in Owen's position. The original mortgage on Sarah's farm had a clause, a Depression-era provision that had never been removed, stipulating that any transfer of the note to a third party required the consent of the borrower. Owen had acquired the debt through a backdoor purchase of the bank's holding company, bypassing that consent. If we could prove the transfer was invalid, the foreclosure would collapse. But proving it meant taking on Owen in court, and that required money Sarah didn't have. Money I didn't have, unless we found a way to fund a legal war while keeping the farm afloat through harvest. That's when the triplets, in their own uncanny way, entered the story again. Lily, the one who'd first whispered to me on the road, had been listening to our worried conversations. One evening, she climbed onto my lap with a crumpled piece of paper clutched in her tiny fist. It was a drawing, a crude crayon sketch of a house, a barn, 4 stick figures, and a man with a line across his face. "Daddy said you'd need this," she said. "He told me in a dream to give it to you when you were sad." I unfolded the paper. On the back, in David's handwriting, was a phone number and a name, Franklin Delacroix, Agricultural Justice Fund, with a note that read, "If the banks ever come for the farm, call this man. He owes me a favor." I called the number the next morning. Franklin Delacroix turned out to be a retired class-action attorney who'd made millions suing predatory lenders. 30 years earlier, David's father had pulled him from a burning tractor. He'd sworn he'd repay the debt someday. When I explained the situation, he didn't hesitate. He flew in from Phoenix 3 days later, set up a war room in my living room, and began filing motions that made Owen's lawyers choke on their own briefs. But Owen wasn't done. When he realized we had legal ammunition, he escalated in a way that went beyond land and money. He showed up at the farmer's market where Sarah sold her produce, flanked by 2 county deputies, and publicly accused her of defrauding the bank by hiding assets. The accusation was baseless, but the spectacle was the point. By the time the deputies backed down, half the town had heard the allegation, and Sarah's stall was empty of customers for the rest of the day. The final blow came not from Owen directly, but from a source I'd never anticipated. Richard Lansing, feeling sidelined by Owen's legal troubles, decided to take matters into his own hands. He contacted the state veterinary board and filed an anonymous complaint alleging that I was neglecting my animal patients to spend time at Sarah's farm. The complaint was frivolous, but it triggered an investigation that could have cost me my license. I had to spend hours pulling records and getting affidavits from clients while the clock on the foreclosure ticked louder. I was being attacked on 3 fronts: my land, my livelihood, and my relationship with the woman I was falling in love with. For a few dark days, I genuinely considered giving up, letting Owen have the farm, moving away, starting over somewhere nobody knew my name or my scars. But then I came home one night to find Sarah sitting on my porch steps, the triplets asleep in the cab of her truck. She'd driven over to tell me something, and the look on her face told me it wasn't good news. "He made an offer," she said quietly. "Owen came to see me today, alone. He said if I leave you, if I take the girls and walk away from whatever this is between us, he'll forgive the entire debt. He'll let me keep the farm free and clear. He just wants you to be alone, that's his price." She started to cry, not from fear, but from the impossible position he'd put her in. She loved me. I knew it. I loved her too, but she also loved her daughters, and the farm was their inheritance. Owen had found the one pressure point that could break us. I knelt in front of her and took her hands. "What did you tell him?" She looked at me, her eyes red but fierce. "I told him that I'd rather lose the farm 100 times than lose the man who showed up on my worst day and never left. I told him that my husband sent you and I wasn't going to betray that gift. I told him no. Across the county, as if to mock our defiance, a judge set the foreclosure hearing for the following Monday. We had 6 days to find a legal miracle, or the gavel would fall, and Owen would own everything David had built. The 5 days before the hearing were the longest of my life. Franklin Delacroix turned my living room into a command center, stacks of legal documents piled on every flat surface, empty coffee mugs multiplying like barn cats. He'd found the smoking gun in Owen's Shell Corporations, a paper trail showing that the holding company which bought Sarah's loan hadn't actually existed when the transfer was signed. The notarized document was dated March 12th, but the company wasn't registered with the Secretary of State until March 19th. It was a backdated fraud, plain as day. When Joanne Kepler saw it, she actually smiled. "We don't just win the motion," she said. "We might own the bank by the time I'm done." But Owen wasn't the kind of man to fold. The day before the hearing, he made his final move. He filed an emergency motion with the court requesting that I be removed as Sarah's representative because of an undisclosed romantic entanglement that constituted a conflict of interest. He'd somehow gotten photographs of us, the two of us on my porch, my hand on her face, the kind of private moment no one should ever capture. Someone had been watching. Richard Lansing, it turned out, had hired a private investigator to tail us for weeks. The motion was a stall tactic, designed to throw our legal standing into chaos the day before we were set to save the farm. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my porch, the same porch where Alina had stood in the old transcript, and stared at the stars. Around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "I know what Owen is hiding. Meet me at the old Morris place at dawn." Against every instinct, I went. The old Morris place was one of the farms Owen had already absorbed, its farmhouse now dark and gutted. Waiting in the pre-dawn mist was a man I'd never expected to see. Brad Miller, the same handyman who tried to torch my barn in the original transcript. In this reality, Brad had been Richard Lansing's man, hired to keep tabs on us. But he'd grown a conscience. He handed me a thumb drive with audio recordings of Owen and Richard discussing the fraudulent loan transfer, the pressure on the bank president, and even the false complaint to the veterinary board, recorded in Owen's own voice. "He thinks I'm just muscle," Brad said, his face pale. "But I'm done being used. That's my confession, whatever it costs me." I didn't have time to process the moral complexity. I drove straight to Franklin's motel, and we spent the remaining hours preparing the evidence. When the hearing gavel fell Monday morning, the courtroom was packed. Sarah sat beside me, the triplets with a neighbor in the hallway. Owen sat at the opposing table with 2 lawyers who looked like they billed by the blink. The judge, a severe woman named Honorable Patricia Ellison, read the case file with a grim expression. Joanne rose first. She laid out the invalidity of the loan transfer, the backdated incorporation documents, and the direct link to Owen's controlling interest in Prescott Development. Then Franklin, in his slow southern drawl, played the audio. Owen's voice filled the silent room, his words stripped of polish. "The judge won't dig deep. Small-town courts don't get into corporate structures. Just get the lien in place and we'll own the widow's land by Christmas." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Sarah gripped my hand so tightly I lost feeling in my fingers. Owen's lawyer tried to object: illegally obtained evidence, chain of custody, but Judge Ellison overruled him with a single word: "Sit." She listened to the full recording, then the additional clip where Owen explicitly offered to forgive Sarah's debt if she abandoned me. That wasn't just business. It was coercive interference in a personal relationship, designed to inflict emotional harm. The judge's face, already stern, turned stone cold. But the final blow came from an unexpected quarter. The bank president, a nervous man named Gerald Huff, had been subpoenaed by Joanne the previous Friday. Facing potential criminal charges for accepting a fraudulent guarantee, he cracked on the stand. He admitted that Owen had strong-armed him into accelerating Sarah's loan, that the bank had accepted falsified collateral documents, and that the entire foreclosure was built on a lie. The moment the words left his mouth, Owen's empire collapsed. Judge Ellison didn't deliberate long. She ruled that the loan transfer was void. the foreclosure dismissed with prejudice, and the original mortgage reinstated under its Depression-era terms, which, it turned out, included a 5-year interest-free forbearance for farming families in distress. Sarah's farm was safe, not just for now, but for years to come. Then she turned her gaze to Owen and added, "I'm also referring this matter to the State Attorney General for investigation of fraud and predatory lending practices. You may consider yourself fortunate if you don't see the inside of a courtroom as a defendant." Owen's face went the color of old milk. For the first time since that day on my porch, his mask slipped. He looked at me, really looked, and what I saw wasn't anger. It was emptiness. The same emptiness I'd been running from my whole life. I had spent 15 years hatting him, and now all I felt was pity. The gallery erupted. Rosa, who'd driven Sarah to the earliest court dates, was openly weeping. Sebastian clapped his calloused hands together just like the original story, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Father Thomas, who'd been praying in the back row, raised his eyes heavenward and nodded. And when we stepped outside into the October sunshine, the triplets broke free from their neighbor and sprinted toward us. Lily reached me first, planting her small face against my leg, and this time she didn't whisper. She shouted, loud enough for the whole town to hear, "You did it, Daddy. Daddy kept his promise." I knelt down and gathered all 3 of them in my arms. I couldn't speak. I didn't need to. When I looked up, Sarah was standing over us, her tears falling onto my scarred cheek. "You're not just the man who jumped my battery," she said, her voice breaking. "You're the man who jumped my whole life back to the living." That evening, the town gathered in the square, just as they had in the transcript I was echoing, but this time the celebration was for us. The band played, the children danced, and the older farmers shook my hand with a new kind of respect, not pity, not aversion, but genuine admiration. Franklin Delacroix, before he flew back to Phoenix, pulled me aside. "Your brother's holdings are going to be frozen during the investigation. The farms he took might actually revert to their original owners. This isn't just a win for you. It's a win for half the county." I thought of David's letter and the pact he'd made with his daughters and the impossible chain of events that had led to this moment. A dead battery, a child's whispered plea, a dying man's dream, all of it had converged to save not just one farm but many. Later, when the music had faded and the crowd thinned, Sarah and I sat under the old oak tree on her property. The triplets were asleep in the house, exhausted from dancing. She leaned her head on my shoulder and we watched the stars emerge. "I have one more thing to tell you," she said, her voice soft. "Something I found in David's papers this morning." She pulled out a small envelope I hadn't seen before. Inside was a single photograph, taken a decade before I'd ever set foot in this town. It showed a younger version of me at a 4-H fair, holding a lamb I'd treated. David had been there with his own sheep project. He'd circled my face in red ink and written one word beneath it: him. "He didn't just dream about you," Sarah whispered. "He saw you years ago, and he remembered." I sat there with the photograph in my hand, a decade-old image of a younger me holding a lamb, circled in red ink by a dying man I'd never met, and I understood something I'm still trying to put into words. David hadn't just dreamed about a stranger helping his family. He'd seen me, years before, and filed away the memory like a promise he intended to keep. That battery on the dirt road wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the middle. The beginning happened at a 4-H fair when a man with months left to live looked at a scarred veterinarian and saw the person his daughters would one day need. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the farm transformed. The bank reinstated the loan on terms that let Sarah breathe for the first time since David's death. Owen's assets were frozen, and the farms he'd stolen began returning to their original families. Brad Miller, the man who tried to burn my barn, gave testimony that sent shockwaves through the county, and Richard Lansing quietly moved out of state, his influence crumbling as fast as his reputation. The town that once whispered about my scar now greeted me with respect, not because my face had changed, but because I had finally stopped hiding it. The triplets turned for that spring. Lily, the one who'd first whispered her impossible request, now calls me Daddy without hesitation, and her sisters followed as naturally as if the word had been waiting for them all along. We held a small ceremony under the old oak tree, not a wedding, not yet, but a covenant. Sarah, the girls, and I planted a sapling where the deadly branch had fallen, a living reminder that what nearly destroyed us can become the soil for something new. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. Every one of us has a dead battery moment, a time when we're stranded on the side of the road out of options, watching the world drive past. And every one of us has the chance to be the person who stops. I almost didn't. I was one hesitation away from staying in my truck, letting someone else handle it. One small choice separated the rest of my life from the loneliness I'd accepted as permanent. That's the terrifying, beautiful truth. Kindness isn't always grand. Sometimes it's a pair of jumper cables and 10 minutes you didn't think you had. The girls don't remember their father's voice anymore, but they know his love because he talked to them in his final days about a good man who was coming. I'll never replace David. I don't have to. I'm the continuation of a story he started writing when he told his daughters to watch for kindness. And every night when I tuck them in, I see his trust looking back at me through their eyes. That's a weight I'll carry gladly for the rest of my life. So if you're out there, driving your own road and you see someone who's stranded, literally or otherwise, I'm asking you to stop. You don't have to be a saint. You don't have to fix everything. Just show up. Because the battery you jump might be the one that's been failing for years, and a child's whisper might just be the answer to your own unspoken prayer. Thanks for spending this hour with our story. If it meant something to you, share it with someone who needs reminding that hope isn't finished with them yet. And hit subscribe if you want more stories about the moments that prove no kindness is ever wasted. I'm Matthew Vale, and I'll see you next time.